Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Imperial Armour. You'd thought I'd forgotten, didn't you? No. I have been thinking of continuing the series for a while, and I have been receiving quite a few messages, particularly recently, asking if I had any plans to do so. And yes, fear not. For today, we are going to be talking about the iconic Leman Russ main battle tank, which in recognizability in terms of 40k is probably only second to the pampered favoured sons, the Space Marines. Not bad for the mere bastard offspring of a Mark I tank and a KV with a 152mm gun. But despite the humble origins, the Leman Russ main battle tank is now probably the single most valuable armoured fighting vehicle in the entirety of the Imperium, as no other tank is produced in anywhere near the quantity of the Leman Russ, which makes up the sturdy backbone of any armoured regiment. And whilst it may not be quite as prolific, incestuous, some might say, as the Chimera we've talked about previously, the Leman Russ has nevertheless produced dozens of different variants. Everything from demolishers designed to blast apart fortifications at point-blank range to vanquishers, long-range anti-tank snipers. The Leman Russ can do it all, and probably has done it all across countless battlefields all across the galaxy. And a bit later on in the video, we will be delving into detail. We will be looking at its internals, its variants, its weaponry, its armor, and, of course, how the Leman Russ is used, depending, of course, upon its many variants. But before we get to that, first things first, we need to start with the origin of the Leman Russ, and the reason why it is named after the Primarch of the Space Wolves. And no, it's not purely because of the tank's pugnacious appearance, but rather because it was the Space Wolves who discovered the STC, the standard template construct pattern for the battle tank. It was discovered on the planet Nova Borilla, which was at the time occupied by a most foul and degenerate Xenos race known as the Gnomon. They had enslaved the local human populace, the people who had brought the STC construct to the planet in the first place. And the sons of Leman Russ, the Vlaka Fenrica, obviously did not take particularly kindly to this. They exterminated the Xenos, liberated the human populace, and rediscovered the standard template construct. Then they had a good long laugh at it, pointed at it, mocked it, and then decided to give it the name of their Primarch, presumably in jest. The reason why I say it that way is because, well, bear you in mind, this is old lore right here. The Leman Russ is a really ancient part of 40k, and I'm sure back in the day it was intended to be a pretty darn good main battle tank. It was to be the best tank in an Imperium that had long since forgotten how technology works and truly evolves and progresses. But these days, when we have the 30k Horus Heresy series, we can look at tanks like the Fellblades and the Sikaran battle tanks and realize the Leman Russ must have looked like a particularly poor proposition at the time. Indeed, rather than being designated as a main battle tank, the best the Leman Russ could probably hope for would be a slot as a light scout, perhaps. Even the regiments of the Imperial Army at the time were swimming in super heavies, after all. But again, we're bringing old lore into the current day, aren't we? And so little things like these are inevitable. Plus, it's entirely possible that I wasn't joking earlier, and that the Space Wolves simply cast one glance at the Leman Russ and said, yeah, That's our Primarch right there. A bit on the ugly side, but stubborn and carrying a big gun. A third possibility is also that the Space Wolves never even actually saw the Leman Russ at all. They simply discovered an STC design, handed it over to the Mechanicus, who decided to name it in honor of their Primarch. And hey, it worked out pretty well in the end after all, since these days when super heavy tanks are a rare and precious commodity only produced by a handful of forged worlds throughout the Imperium, Leman Russ has risen quite significantly in the grades. And whilst we're on the topic, let me also have a quick little chance to address one of the obvious complaints about the Leman Russ, namely that it isn't a particularly good main battle tank. Oh, it carries a lot of guns, absolutely, and armed with a 120mm smoothbore cannon, it's certainly got some firepower. In fact, the cannon on the model is a lot bigger than the supposed caliber suggests, but again, hey, details. The entire point of the standard template constructs was to create relatively simplistic, rugged, and easily produced vehicles and equipment for colonies that were sent into space in the earliest age of humanity. Basically, the STC's designs were a sort of internet meets 3D printer kind of solution. Which reminds me, I really do need to make a full lore video on the STC designs and templates at some point, but for now, long story short, human colonies were dispatched to the other side of the galaxy, and they would have to be able to produce anything they needed to live and thrive on that planet, regardless of the resources at hand. Maybe the planet was lacking in a particular resource, maybe it was abundant in another, but the colonists still required food. They still needed some way to defend themselves, they still needed some way to till the soil, etc, etc. And so the STC concepts were designed to be as versatile as possible, something that could be produced from universal resources, relatively easily, relatively cheaply, quickly, and successfully. That's the idea of the STC constructs. The Leman Russ main battle tank is, well, the STC variant of the AK-47. Relatively simple, very reliable, and more than adequate for the job at hand. And that was to only be the very beginning of the Leman Russ's journey. As the template was fully understood by the Mechanicus, it was wildly disseminated throughout the Imperium, ever more rapidly as the years progressed towards the 41st millennium, as the simplicity, rugged nature, and overall efficiency of the design was more and more widely recognized, eventually leading it to become the backbone of Imperial armored formations that it is today. And with wide dissemination also came a variety of different designs and specifications. Some of these were custom made to fulfill particular battlefield roles, like the Vanquisher for example, whilst others were created due to simple expediency. The planet which has gotten the STC design just happened to be an expert in plasma-based weaponry. They had a long and proud history in creating both weapons and engines, and so they had one look at the Leman Russ and thought to themselves, we could mount a huge-ass plasma cannon on that thing, couldn't we? And so they did, giving birth to the Leman Russ Executioner. Other Forge Worlds went even further, deciding to improve upon the design, most often by taking away the turret. Which seems silly at first, but the benefit of mounting the weapon either on top of the hull or inside of it is an even simpler design, and the ability to mount an even larger gun. In some cases, this resulted in a weapon even more complex, in fact, than the Leman Russ, like the Destroyer Tank Hunter, Now, the hull itself is still the same ruggedly simplistic design, but the laser destroyer mounted in the hull is a highly complex and technologically advanced anti-tank weapon, capable of reducing pretty much any other armor to molten slag in a single blast. This also used to be one of the most common variant of the Leman Russ, since it removed the primary shortcoming, at least by 30k standards, the gun, and replaced it with something far more devastating. Though in the modern day Imperium, the laser destroyer is a weapon barely understood, and only a handful of master craftsmen scattered across a tiny number of forge worlds throughout the Imperium have the technological skill and knowledge to produce them anymore. And so the numbers of destroyers are rapidly dwindling. Those regiments that still have access to them value them greatly. Something the Imperium does know how to build quite easily, however, is another variant, the Thunderer Siege Tank. This one carries a demolisher cannon mounted in the hull. Essentially just a massive-ass cannon, and with the weapon's lower profile, it has a better chance at getting up to enemy fortifications without being blasted to pieces, whereupon it can deliver the tremendous high-explosive payload of its main ordnance directly into a bunker. Or, alternatively, if getting close is really not an option, then what about the Colossus Bombard? Whereas the Basilisk is mounted on the lighter Chimera pattern hull, the Bombard would probably crush the Chimera hull, and so it is mounted on a Leman Russ chassis, and classified as a heavy siege mortar, lobbing massive armor-penetrating ordnance to strike through the top of emplaced fortifications, blasting them apart and creating a satisfyingly sized crater whilst doing so. But these vehicles might get their own Imperial Armour video at some point in the distant future, but trust me, it might happen sometime before the return of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ. So, rub yourself with patience and all that. We shall return now to the proper Leman Russ instead, and its variants, because I feel like chopping the turret off it makes it a bit less Leman Russy. So let us finally then get into some cold hard specifications. The most common standard variant of the Leman Russ main battle tank comes with a crew of 4 or 6, depending upon its sponson weaponry. A commander, gunner, driver, and loader, with 2 additional crew members being added on in the case of sponson weapons, that being, of course, 2 gunners. It is powered by an HL230 V12 multi-fuel engine, which propels the 60 tons of the vehicle at a speed of 35 kilometers on-road and 21 off. This leaves it with a pretty underpowered engine considering its size and its weight. At 7 meters long, 4.8 meters wide, and 4.4 meters high, it is significantly larger than an M1A1 Abrams tank, whilst weighing round about the same amount and travelling at almost half the speed. And to compare it to something a little more along the lines of its original inspiration, the Leman Russ is both larger and heavier and slower than both an IS-2 or a Tiger tank, though the Leman Russ does boast a lot of armor, even more than these World War II vehicles, as the hull of the Leman Russ is 150 millimeters thick, the gun mantlet is 100 millimeters, and the turret itself is a mighty 200 millimeters thick, leaving the Leman Russ in a bit of a weird limbo, where the engine is severely underpowered by modern standards, and yet pretty damn powerful by World War II standards. Boasting twice the armor of either of these vehicles, is able to keep up a speed only 10 kilometers slower on a paved surface, which is not bad. But either way, whilst a certain German may have claimed that the main weapon of a tank is its engine, let's be fair here. Everybody loves a big gun, and the Leman Russ comes equipped with the infamous battle cannon, a 120mm smoothbore weapon capable of taking a variety of ammunition, the most common of which of course being the Leman Russ Mark IV G4 high-explosive round and the Mark XII G4 anti-tank armor-piercing round. These munitions give the tank the ability to fulfill a wide variety of battlefield roles. The high explosive comes with a relatively small propellant charge, as velocity is not the point when it comes to anti-infantry combat. The shell is instead filled with a large amount of high explosive material, most usually fissile. This then detonates immediately upon impact, blasting apart anything silly enough to be nearby. In contrast, the Mark XII armor-piercing round has a very large propellant charge to send the projectile with as much velocity as possible towards the target, whereas the armor-piercing capabilities is provided by a solid adamantium-tipped shell covered by a soft metal cap, which is expected to deform upon impact, ensuring that the adamantium tip does not bounce or slide off the target. In these cases, the primary damage to the enemy vehicle will be caused by the trauma of the impact, filling the vehicle with spalling. And just in case you're unaware of the terminology there, spalling is the phenomenon that happens when the outside of a tank's armor is struck with such tremendous force that the inside of the armor, the side where the squishy humans are, begins to spall, to shear apart, to crack and to splinter, sending those splinters firing off into the tank like shrapnel. Basically, the primary weapon of such a shell is not actually the shell itself, but the tank's own armor. Any damage done by the actual adamantium-tipped shell is merely a bonus. Now, this does have a lot of weaknesses, however, and can be relatively easy to counter, which is why there is also a variant of this shell which has a small high-explosive charge coming in behind the armor-breaking adamantium tip, which will ensure that even if the spalling doesn't kill the crew, the high explosive charge on a slight detonation timer, ensuring that the weapon will penetrate the armor, pass inside the tank, and then detonate, will take care of the crew. As for other, more esoterical rounds, there is of course good old-fashioned smoke rounds. Never underestimate the power of good old-fashioned smoke. Because, quite simply put, the shortest way to ensure you survive a battle is to simply just not be hit at all. And if the enemy can't see you, they're gonna have a far harder time hitting you. Other variants is things like the Mark VII G4 Infernus round. This is similar to the high explosive round, but instead of an HE filler core to the weapon, it contains an incendiary material like phosphorine or termite. So instead of killing via the explosive force, it will scatter these incendiaries over a large area. Very effective towards soft-skinned targets, and in the case of enemies holed up in buildings, you can overcome some of that otherwise unfortunate overpressure protection. And finally, the rarest, most precious, most valuable shell of them all, the Hunter shell. This is a very, very special one, and you can be absolutely assured that if the crew is blessed enough to possess a Hunter shell, they will be babying it to no end, polishing it, making sure it's always within reach, yet also always protected from the damp, from the dirt, from anything. Basically, they were treated like World War II tankers treated their rare and precious tungsten shells. There's even tails, and bear in mind, tungsten is essentially a far heavier and more solid material than almost anything else, giving it superlative armor-piercing capabilities. This meant that the crew would fire these shells when they came up against something really heavy, that their normal ammunition was not at all guaranteed to penetrate, like a Sherman crew coming across a Tiger tank, for example. And since these shells then were the difference between life and death, the crews took very good care of them. I remember one instance in a book describing a German tank crew. They had a tungsten shell, and the crew had it wrapped in blankets inside of the tank's cupola to make sure that no dust or dirt would foul its perfect trajectory. But the Hunter is an even more lethal killer, as the shell contains a small logic engine, a homing device essentially, turning the shell into more of a guided missile rather than simply a tank round. The weapon is first locked onto the target, and then when fired, it shoots straight up, using its own maneuvering abilities to get over the target, take a sharp turn down, and strike the thin, vulnerable upper armor of the enemy tank. Sounds kind of OP, right? Because, well, it is. It is the fundament of quite a few modern-day anti-tank systems, in fact, though, unfortunately, as with so many things in the 41st millennium, they are beyond rare. The only Forge world to have been able to successfully produce them in quantities was Tigris, and that's currently occupied by the Orcs. So, yeah. But the battle cannon is, of course, not the only anti-tank weapon mounted on a Leman Russ. Often mounted in the hull is a las cannon. Now this is an interesting piece of Imperial tech because rather than simply having been salvaged from STC patterns, the las cannon, the las gun, and Imperial las tech in general is something that the Imperium has been using and working on for so goddamn long now that they actually kind of understand how it works. It sounds mildly ridiculous, but such is the technological degradation of the Imperium. The very idea that they've got a gun that they actually understand is, well, a rarity. But despite its understandability, the las cannon is a very effective weapon. I've sung the praises of the las gun previously because whilst it may lack somewhat the oomph of a bolter or a large caliber solid slug weapon, the ability to continuously recharge a weapon, to bring reusable ammo packs into battle, is a pretty damn big deal when it comes to easing up the logistical problems. And with the las cannon in this case being attached to a ginormous tank with a huge engine, it's able to draw all the energy it needs directly from the engine. This incidentally might also be one of the reasons why it appears a little underpowered. It might be that so much of its energy is actually used to power the las cannon that energy for traction, etc. might be a bit of a secondary concern. I could see an argument for that, absolutely, though one would think it would then be possible to set the drive in travel mode and regain the speed, but hey, theory crafting and all that. Because normally the las cannon either needs to be attached to a major power generation source, or the energy capacitor, the battery quote unquote, will need to be replaced after each and every shot. such is the tremendous energy unleashed by the weapon. And hungry as it is, it really is worth it, as the tremendous heat blast from the las cannon is enough to flash boil most armored plating. In this case, I suppose we return to the spalling phenomenon, but now the fragmentation is also on fire. Yes, I imagine that'll wreak some pretty hefty havoc on the internals of any fighting vehicle. And we must, of course, not forget the sponsored weaponry. Now, the sponsors on the Leman Russ can be a reasonable variety of weapons. You can have flamethrowers mounted there, which again seems ridiculous. Oh, you're gonna mount a pair of backup flamethrowers, are you, on your tank? But hey, if nothing else, it'll make sure that infantry won't get close, so I suppose it's actually not as silly as it initially might look. But the most common weapon mounted in the sponsons are the heavy bolters. On most tanks, machine guns are there as not really so much an offensive weapon as a defensive one. They're intended to spray out bullets everywhere to give the infantry something to worry about whilst they try to sneak up on it with handheld anti-tank weaponry, mines, or explosive charges. In the case of the heavy bolter, however, whilst I am sure that will be an incidental effect of the weapon, it is far more offensively minded than your average heavy machine gun. Firing on full-auto, rocket-propelled grenades the size of a grown man's hands, you don't even need to be hit by the damn things to be killed by them. And of course, cover is a very relative term. Whilst one might try to sneak through a cropping of trees, or through some buildings, for example, to gain an advantageous position on the tank, and these might provide some protection against light and medium machine guns, against a heavy bolter, they're nothing more than added fragmentation projectiles to be blasted, torn apart, and sent flying through the air by the detonation of literal grenades. A pair of sponson-mounted heavy bolters do not suppress an enemy anti-tank team hidden in a forest line. It mulches the entire tree line alongside the anti-tank team. And, as an added bonus, a heavy bolter is not only useful against infantry, it'll make damnably short work of light armored vehicles as well. In terms of efficiency, there really isn't all that many better weapons in the 41st millennium. Now, you could argue that a heavy stubber would do somewhat the same job, but when the anti-tank team you're trying to suppress is a horde of screaming orcs with rocket launchers, you want a little bit of extra punch, don't you? And a heavy stabber might not quite cut it. The only drawback I can see immediately is the fact that heavy bolter ammo's pretty goddamn big, and the internal spaces of the Leman Russ are already fairly cramped as they are. Let us now have a little bit of a look at the internal workings of a standard pattern Leman Russ, shall we? Up near the top, you can see the turret and the main battle cannon. You can see the commander's cupola, and you can see the gunner and the loader's seats and positions. You see a pair of rounds are loaded inside the turret. They are there for ease of reloading the main cannon for the highest rate of fire possible. Though, as a little bit of a side note here, this is a little bit of a speculative internal design, taken from various sources and also a little bit of logical guesswork, as Games Workshop hasn't really gone as deep into detail as one may have wanted. The shells stored in the turret is a common practice in pretty much every tank, for as long as we've had tanks, because it allows for a much greater rate of fire, as you're able to reload the cannon quickly when it matters the most. You also see further rounds stacked in the basket beneath the turret ring. This is the secondary ammo storage area, not as easily accessible, but still far more easily accessible than the extra ammo stored at the bottom of the tank on the floor beneath the crew's basket. This is a more unorthodox thing. A lot of crews during the Second World War, for example, just wanted to cram as much ammo into their tanks as conceivably possible because they might be faced with more targets than they had ammo. In such a situation, whoopsies. So you can see why they might want to bring a little bit of extra ammo. In the battlefield of the 41st millennium, and particularly dealing with ammunition as massive as that found in the Leman Russ, oh, you definitely want to be cramming in a couple extra rounds. The downside, of course, is that those shells could be hit by something high explosive and, well, that would be quite unfortunate, but in many cases it's better to have a couple of extra shells tucked away than rely on just the regular ammunition storage. You can also, towards the rear, see the pretty darn massive engine of the Leman Russ. Built upwards into a large bulge on the part of the tank, it is, however, relatively compact for its size and power. Bearing in mind also the armor, I direct your attention towards the armor on the hull and the turret sections, which are both very, very thick. Now, we actually had a look at this, and getting the turret to be as thick as it's supposed to be would be very difficult, whilst also allowing for some space for the actual gun and the occupant, so take that with a pinch of salt. Next, let's have a look at its externals. You can get a good look at here at just how large the sponsons are. These could have crews sitting inside of the sponsons, or alternatively, gunner servitors operating the weaponry, depending a bit on the technological level of the world that utilizes and produces the tanks. You can also see smoke launchers mounted on the turret, as well as some escape hatches, including one at the rear of the tank, allowing for a quick and easy egress from the vehicle should it be the victim of none too friendly attention from the enemy. And speaking of those assholes on the other side that keeps shooting at you, you have probably noticed the tracks that are integrated into the chassis. This is a very interesting design that you don't see much around these days for, well, frankly, very good reasons. On the one hand, it is advantageous in that you are protecting the tracks from, outside influences. Shrapnel, bullets, guns, explosions, and these things. This is a good thing. However, if the tracks themselves are shot, or God help you, the road wheels... Oh, God Emperor, pity the little bastard who has to fix it. To give you an idea, let me show you this cutaway here of the Mark 8 Liberty tank, where you can see a large, nice little cutaway. This was the best cutaway of this kind of tank I could find, and it'll give you a decent idea. You can see a little bit of the road wheels both in the front and running along the bottom of the tank, along as the primary drive train as well. Imagine if, say, an anti-tank round or a las cannon round burns out the front or the rear drive wheel or the little road wheels. The only way you can fix that would be by demounting the entire flank of the tank and then fixing the road wheel. Oy. That'd be an annoying battlefield repair. Hell, the crews of the German Tiger thought they had it awful when they occasionally had to remove tons of drive wheels to get to the rearward ones. At least they didn't have to deconstruct half their tank before getting to them. All in all then, the Leman Russ is Certainly a somewhat archaic design, no doubt about that, but as a platform primarily intended to deliver a very large gun, a las cannon, and two only slightly smaller guns, it certainly gets the job done. Now let's have a look at some variants, shall we? Starting with my personal favourite, the Vanquisher. The main difference is immediately obvious in that the gun is much longer, resulting in far superior muzzle velocity, giving both greater accuracy and long-range performance plus armor piercing. Now, unfortunately, the Vanquisher was originally only produced on the Forge world of Tigris. Yes, that Tigris. The one currently under new and green leadership. But unlike the Hunter shell, the production of the Vanquisher's long-barreled cannon was not quite as advanced as the Hunter shells, and two Forge worlds, Stygius 8 and Griffin 4, have both been able to replicate the effect of the long-barreled Vanquisher cannon, albeit with slightly different methods. This is, of course, a grand and glorious thing, as it means that the Vanquisher will not go extinct just yet. But unfortunately, the internal workings of the Mechanicus and the rivalries between various adepts means that the two Forge worlds keep their secrets very confidential, and they do not disseminate them to the other worlds that might see a rise in Vanquisher production. Only these two Forge worlds produce them. Once again, the Mechanicus bites the hand that feeds, eh? Because, well, the ability to mass-produce tank destroyers of a superior quality, which would still be able to engage in an anti-infantry role as well, because here's the thing, a bigger, better anti-tank main cannon is excellent, and you can make up for any lack in infantry killing power by simply mounting a third heavy bolter to the hull. In all due honesty, the Vanquisher is simply just a superior design to the regular Leman Russ main battle tank, in my humble and completely unbiased opinion. But, oh well, let's deviate onto something completely different, shall we? The Leman Russ Exterminator. Oh, Exterminator. Now there's a name with some certain expectations attached to it, eh? Full-on extermination. What kind of weaponry is mounted here then? It is a twin-barreled autocannon. Oh yes. I think it might very well earn its name as an exterminator with that kind of armament, as that would be one hell of a blitzing barrage of high-caliber explosive rounds. More than enough to shred entire platoons of infantry should they be stupid enough to wander into its line of sight. Not to mention, a twin-barreled autocannon firing high-explosive rounds would do quite the number on APCs or lightly armored vehicles. God help any skimmer that gets within its pretty damn generous elevation. With a negative score of 8 degrees and a positive all the way up to 26, it could almost be employed with a little bit of luck as an AA gun. Yes, granted, it would require a very cooperative target, but theoretically, it's not completely impossible. And if you're feeling extra sadistic, you could of course always mount a pair of heavy bolters in the sponsons and toss on a las cannon up front, just in case you run into something a little bit heavier than you had intended to engage. With the Exterminator 2, you definitely want to stock up on the ammo. Pile it on up high. In the main ammo storage, obviously, in the basket, of course, on the floor, in every nook and cranny, because I guarantee you this thing would eat through the ammo at a frightening rate. And on that note, how about something the absolute complete opposite? The Leman Russ Executioner. An executioner, exterminator, sounds a bit similar, right? So what's the big deal here then? Well, it's the plasma destroyer mounted in its turret. Oh, las cannon. See, las cannon will make a large, glowing, sludgy hole in a tank and spray the internal compartments with burning liquidized metal. Uncomfortable, to be sure, but a tank could, possibly, conceivably, survive such a hit. If an armored vehicle short of a super heavy gets struck by a plasma destroyer, however, you'd be lucky if you could locate the tracks, much less the rest of the hull. And, well, that is of course partially the point of its name, isn't it? This is not a weapon designed to annihilate large groups of hostile infantry, though a close-range hit will probably do a pretty damn good job of that as well. Oh no, this is a precision weapon of absolute assured destruction. This is the weapon you bring to kill an massive enemy bioweapon, or a super heavy tank, or when you absolutely, without fail, needs to completely annihilate an armored vehicle. But of course, such awesome destructive force has its drawbacks. Most of the turret space is occupied by a huge energy converter, utilizing battery cells to draw energy into the weapon, to charge the plasma coils, and send the lethal plasma hurtling towards the enemy at high speeds. This is a very, very delicate piece of machinery, and most of the battle is of course exposed out the front of the tank. Exposing such delicate parts to enemy fire is, often not wise, but in this case, they really don't have all that much in the way of a choice. The tank's hull is also often covered with additional venting systems. In case of a minor problem, excess heat can be removed from the weapon swiftly and effectively. There is also additional heat shielding laced throughout the armor to protect the crew, both from aforementioned accidents and from simply just the discharging of their main weapon. And even then, with all of these safety features, this is not a loved tank. Oh god, no. Any crew ordered to serve aboard an executioner, more often than not, will be doing so as some form of punishment. Because if anything goes wrong, no matter how often the company commissar may insist that, oh no, it's perfectly safe. See, we've even added in extra escape hatches for you. You'll be fine. Many a crew has come across the blasted out remains of an executioner and, rather doubt their commissar's reassurances on this particular matter. This in turn has caused many local commissars of regiments equipped with executioners' tanks to, put in place additional sanctions, restrictions. No, not even something so harsh. Rules of engagement. Yes, that's what we'll call it. Rules of engagement. Number 1, you may not abandon your tank. Yes. That is in effect, even if the inside of it starts glowing cherry red. Hey, the commissar's not expected to board the damn thing after all. And hey, its value on the field of battle is absolutely undebatable. So what if a handful of crews here and there will have to be literally hosed out as molten slug from its internal fighting compartments. The water's relatively cheap after all. And on that heartening, uplifting, propagandistic note, I'll wrap up this video on the Leman Russ main battle tank and a handful of its variants. Again, maybe we'll delve into some of the other ones later, but for now, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon with more lore. Until then, have a good day.